Introduce our first speaker, Professor Daniel Frank. Dan Frank is a professor of philosophy and director of the Jewish Studies program at Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana. He has a very distinguished scholarly record and has written extensively and particularly been responsible or co-responsible for many important edited volumes, including the Cambridge Companion to Medieval Jewish Philosophy, the Jewish Philosophy Reader, History of Jewish Philosophy, 934 pages. He doesn't do things in small formats, and editions of the works of the medieval Jewish philosophers Saadia Gaon and Maimonides. We know him here at the University of Kentucky, of course, above all, as a longtime colleague and friend who taught here from 1980 to 2005. And Dan, we're absolutely delighted that you were able to come down here and be part of this program today. And we're looking forward to hearing your talk on some thoughts on charity and justice in the Jewish tradition. Please welcome Dan, or welcome home, Dan.
Jeremy actually beat me to a number of points I wanted to make, but since they're good points, I'll repeat them. It is good to be back, and not as a stranger, but amongst friends and colleagues. And also, there's a personal side to this that I think I'd like to share with you. And I have 4 kids, and so I have one daughter, Miriam, my youngest, and she is actually doing her bachelor's degree, her full 4-year program, courtesy of the People's Republic of China in Beijing. And she's been very warmly welcomed there. In fact, last year, out of the blue, we got a call that she was having an appendicitis attack. And she would have to go to the hospital, as appendicitis go. And she was taken care of tremendously well. And I just want to share that with respect to Asian and Jewish traditions, they're linked in my mind through her. So my paper today is on the long side, so we'll see how all that goes. But anyway, it's in 4 parts. We begin with some biblical evidence relative to the topic at hand. Then I want to evaluate that evidence a little bit. And then we'll turn to the post-biblical period, some evidence from the rabbis. And then I have a few, if time permits, a few comparisons I'd like to make in the spirit of our symposium. My comparisons will not be between Asian and Jewish cultures, because I know nothing really about Asian cultures, but between some Greek thoughts on the subject and some Jewish thoughts. So here are some thoughts on charity, justice, and care for strangers in the Jewish tradition. And again, Jeremy sort of beat me to the punch a little bit. But Judaism is born in exile in Egypt, a land of oppression and slavery. Throughout the Bible, in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, God himself demands that the Israelite people never forget these beginnings. Why? It's not just a demand to remember humble beginnings and the power of a divine being who liberated his chosen people. It's also a demand to anchor the future in the past, to learn from bitter personal experience, and to learn in such a way that past victims do not become future victimizers. For the record, let's have a few texts in front of us. So here are some famous passages from Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not ill-treat any widow or orphan. If you do mistreat them, I will heed their outcry as soon as they cry out to me, and my anger shall blaze forth, and I will put you to the sword, and your own wives shall become widows, and your children orphans. And a passage from Leviticus. When a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not wrong him. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as one of your own citizens. You shall love him as yourself. Once again, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And then a third passage from Deuteronomy, I think bears mentioning. When you reap the harvest in your field and overlook a sheaf in the field, do not turn back to get it. It shall go to the stranger, the orphan, and the widow, in order that Adonai, your God, shall bless you in all your undertakings. When you beat down the fruit of your olive trees, do not go over them again. That shall go to the stranger, the orphan, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, do not pick it over again. That shall go to the stranger, the orphan, and the widow. And always remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Gerim. Therefore do I enjoin you to observe this commandment. So those are some rather well-known passages that I think are foundational to what I want to be suggesting today. So here are a few passages where we note that the status of being a slave and a stranger, a ger, plural gerim, an outcast of some sort, in Egypt, is key to a moral sensitivity toward the oppressed and the outcast in your own territory. We might think of empathy in this context, a capacity to feel another's pain and sufferings. This is certainly a noble capacity and sits at the very heart of the Jewish tradition. I presume the norm would be to feel bitterness and hate against the backdrop of slavery and oppression. I've always thought that Rod Steiger's achingly powerful portrayal of the pawnbroker in Sidney Lumet's film of the same name is a vivid example of this. A human being broken in spirit, venting his rage against all of humanity almost until the very end. Perhaps this is even healthy in a way. And we should not forget that the 40 years of wandering in the desert before the arrival into the Promised Land, wherein such fellow feeling is to become operational, is a time better the time required and necessary for forgetting the past and recommitting to a new future. In any event, the biblical tradition demands an overcoming of this bitter and vengeful outlook. As we've just seen, the manifestation of such empathy plays out in the demand for non-oppression, no mistreatment, heeding the outcry of the stranger, equal treatment under the law, love, sharing of wealth and food. In short, the foundational biblical tradition demands that those formerly oppressed work hard to overcome the kind of invidious dichotomies that once beleaguered them. Inclusion and justice are mandated. Not to be overlooked is the constant refrain, as we've just heard, to pay special attention to widows and orphans. Why? It seems clear that these two groups are especially vulnerable, weak, and economically disadvantaged. Not only were the Israelite slaves strangers in the land of Egypt, but they were like widows and orphans, each especially vulnerable, weak, and economically disadvantaged. And once again, this status is never to be forgotten on pain of divine discontent. The Hebrew word tzedakah is a familiar one to Jews. In Sunday school, Jewish children give tzedakah, charity if you wish, to the poor by putting a few coins in a little box. Such an activity is doubtless meant to foster a sense of helping those in need. But this gloss and understanding of tzedakah as charity, understood by us as an elective, a magnanimous and supererogatory deed, misses a crucial point of the concept. In its biblical context, tzedakah is not an elective, and in context connotes something like righteousness or justice, what Aristotle calls universal justice in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 5. Moses and the prophets, who call for such righteousness repeatedly over 150 times, are concerned above all with fairness, impartiality, the establishment of law courts, and not taking bribes. In our particular context, The demand entails that the weakness of the poor and the disenfranchised not be grounds for exploitation, that they not be defrauded or in general oppressed. In a basic way, they are equals. Their status counts for naught before the law. Contra the Sunday school lesson, the biblical emphasis on tzedakah is not on self-help and raising the poor out of poverty. Rather, the emphasis is on not taking advantage of those who are vulnerable. This was precisely the condition of the Israelite slaves in Egypt, and it's just this condition of being at risk and being taken advantage of on account of such powerlessness that the biblical authors are calling attention to. Justice is fairness here. The future goal is also clear. While non-oppression of the vulnerable is mandated in the short run, their empowerment, its polar opposite, is the goal. And as we'll see, it's just this last step that is emphasized by the rabbis in the post-biblical period. At least the rabbi I'll be talking about. For the moment, we should note that such empowerment, however, is not for its own sake. Empowerment is in part for the sake of helping those who currently need it, as the Israelites themselves were once helped. God delivered the Israelites out of slavery with the demand that they themselves remember and act as divine agents to those in need in their own midst. In my own little community, we have a Jewish Federation tzedakah fund, and I know Lexington does as well. And in giving money to those in need, we offer it, quite explicitly in fact, in the hope that those who take will soon be able to give. In fact, I guess it was last holiday season, a secret Santa in Reading, Pennsylvania, maybe you read this too, gave away $100 bills with the express hope that those being thankful now will themselves repeat the beneficence next season. The one odd point that must be stressed in all of this is the deontological moment, the imperatival aspect to it all. Not taking advantage, giving, helping, aiding the poor and the oppressed is a command, not an elective in the Jewish tradition. Economic viability carries with it a deep responsibility to those in need. Justice and charity merge in the notion of tzedakah, with choice taking a back seat to duty. Interestingly, we might ponder the notion of freedom here involved. The Israelites were slaves in Egypt, and the freedom and liberation which they won, and of which we sing during Pesach, during Passover, is harnessed to the notion of duty, of law and of duty. All of which forces one to reflect upon the connection between freedom and duty, how precisely freedom from servitude, liberation, is consistent with dutifulness. In the biblical narrative, one gets from the one to the other through memory, a mindfulness of the past, as well as through a divine injunction. Further, as peculiar as it may sound to us, the poor, the economically disadvantaged, have property rights. The poor have property rights that they may claim against us. They are owed a part of the bounty of the crop, as the Deuteronomy passage we read earlier makes clear. A corner of the field is the set-aside property of the poor. For whatever reason the poor end up as such, or for that matter, the widow or the orphan, they are not, must not, be forgotten or overlooked. Judaism provides a safety net for the disadvantaged. In moving forward from the Bible to rabbinic times, tzedakah, though still an obligation and so still a matter of justice, comes to be understood as charity, helping the poor out of poverty. The move thus is from non-oppression, fair treatment, and equality before the law, to self-help and ultimately empowerment. In fleshing out the trajectory here, our focus will be upon Moses Maimonides, of whom I've done much thinking and writing, and his celebrated discussion of charity. A bit of biography, perhaps, will be helpful, and will set the necessary context of the substantive points I wish later to make. So, Maimonides is born in 1138, dies in 1204. He's born in Andalusia, in Cordoba, in Muslim Spain. And at roughly his bar mitzvah age, for reasons we don't have to go into, he was forced to flee, wandered about Spain for a while, ended up in the Maghreb in Morocco, went to Palestine. Unfortunately, the Crusades were going on there, so he didn't stay too long there, and then spent most of his life in Egypt. So he was a person who lived life on the run. He was a stranger in many lands, and so he's a particularly good source, I think, for what we're talking about today. He had a real sensitivity to living under oppression. He wrote famous letters to beleaguered communities who were also under oppression, in Yemen, for example. And most importantly, and hopefully for reasons you can see, given his travels and the insecurities in his life, he was an individual fiercely independent and committed in his own life to economic self-sufficiency, not being dependent upon another. In fact, a personal issue for him cinches the point. His older brother David, who was the source of his family's economic well-being, he was a businessman, I guess. He died at sea, and Maimonides, as a result, suffered severe depression as a result for a long time after, the end result of which is perhaps this fierce independence that he evinced throughout his life. He was a doctor. He made his living by being a court physician, as we'll see. So with respect to this latter point that I just mentioned, economic self-sufficiency, Maimonides famously argues against teaching Torah for a fee. Put differently, he rails against the professionalization of the rabbinate. Maimonides' prohibition is grounded in Avot, a rabbinic text, 4:7. Make not Torah a crown for self-glorification or a spade with which to dig. He quotes this passage in both his commentary on the Mishnah and in his own famous codification of the law, the Mishneh Torah. In the commentary on Perek Helek, from his commentary on the Mishnah, he explicates the rabbinic dictum as follows. They, the rabbis, hinted at what I have just explained to you, that the end of wisdom is neither to acquire honor from other men nor to earn money, earn more money. One ought not to busy oneself with God's Torah in order to learn one's living by it, nor should the end of studying wisdom be anything but knowing it. The truth has no other purpose than knowing that it is truth. Since the Torah is truth, the purpose of knowing it is to do it. And his remarks in Avot are more pointed. One who makes up his mind to study Torah and not to work, but to live on charity, profanes the name of God, brings evil upon himself, and deprives himself of life hereafter. For it is forbidden to derive any temporal advantage from the words of Torah. The sages, the rabbinic sages, said, whoever derives a profit for himself from the words of Torah is helping on his own destruction. For Maimonides, the rabbinic ideal, an ideal instantiated in the sages of old, is to study Torah and teach it free, and have the, what we might call, moral strength of character to see the importance of supporting oneself materially, but not use the former for the sake of the latter. Hillel the elder was a woodcutter. Karna the judge, these are famous rabbis of olden times, a water carrier. Rav Yosef carried logs, and in general for Maimonides, it indicated a high degree of excellence in a man to maintain himself by the labor of his hands. As noted, Maimonides himself was a doctor, and in general his comments on economic viability are consonant with his thoughts on the trajectory of charity and care, as we'll see. The foregoing comments are for present purposes, I think, sufficient. Now let us turn to his famous discussion of charity, tzedakah. In chapter 10, the last chapter of Hilchot Matnot Aniyim, treatise on the gifts for the poor, in the book of Seeds, in his monumental legal codification, the Mishnah Torah, Maimonides offers a famous account of charity, of aiding the poor. Toward the end of that chapter, he says, one should ever patiently strive not to be dependent on other people and not to be a public charge. So too the sages, the ancient rabbis, have enjoined us by saying, make your Sabbath, your day of rest, a weekday, a work day, rather than to be dependent on men. That's how important it is to work. End quote. If reduced to poverty, even a distinguished scholar must not disdain manual work. No matter how unworthy it is of him, If reduced to poverty, even a distinguished scholar must not disdain manual work, no matter how unworthy it is of him, in order to avoid dependence on others. Some of the great sages derive their livelihood from chopping wood, carrying lumber, watering gardens, working in iron, or making charcoal, and asked no help of the community, neither would they have accepted charity had it been offered them. One would be hard-pressed, I think, to find a stronger comment on the importance of economic self-sufficiency and against dependence upon others, no matter what. As noted, this comment comes right at the end of his famous discussion of charity. We might well wonder what Maimonides could possibly have to say about charity given his strong feelings about economic independence. His tough love approach, prima facie, militates against charity. If you're poor, get to work, we hear him snarling. But he doesn't say this, as we'll see, at least not right away. It is against this background of understanding charity as a legal obligation that we may begin our discussion of Maimonides on this topic. A couple of preliminary points. First, we must not overlook the plain fact that for Maimonides, the poor, the beneficiary of charity, are his own brethren. For he asks, quote, on whom should the poor of Israel depend? The discussion, full of insight, I think, as we'll see, is not assimilable to a global context. The poor are not suffering humanity, but poor kinsmen who can depend on no one but their own brethren. This may be a limitation on his theory, but the historical context of discrimination and persecution necessitates his, what we might call, familial approach. Second, and very important, is that the locus of his discussion of charity is not just upon the beneficiary, the poor, but also on the duty-bound benefactor, the giver. For Maimonides, the poor have a claim upon the more fortunate, but the asymmetry of the relationship requires that the former be rather undemonstrative in pressing their claim. So now finally, let's look in some detail at Maimonides' discussion of charity. There are eight stages, 8 steps, if you wish. And we'll start from the bottom rank and move to the highest. 1, so this is levels of charitable beneficence. 1, giving begrudgingly. 2, giving less than you should, but giving it cheerfully. 3, giving after being asked. 4, giving before being asked. 5, giving when you do not know the recipient's identity, but the recipient knows your identity. 6, Giving when you know the recipient's identity, but the recipient doesn't know your identity. 7, giving when neither party knows the other's identity. And the highest level is enabling the recipient to him or herself become self-reliant. The highest stage, which we just saw, of charitable giving is providing aid in the form of a gift or a loan or even gainful employment, a job, such that the beneficiary becomes self-supporting and his status changes. The second stage, from the top, is one in which complete anonymity is preserved on both sides. Neither the benefactor nor the beneficiary is aware of the identity of the other. The third stage is only partially cloaked in anonymity, where the benefactor knows the identity of the recipient but not vice versa. The fourth is the opposite of the third. As Maimonides notes, the great sages used to tie, this is very interesting, the great sages used to tie money in sheets, which they threw behind their backs, and the poor would come and get it without being embarrassed. The avoidance of embarrassment runs, as we see, throughout the entire discussion. Maimonides presumes that the poor are in such straits through no fault of their own, and thus should be treated with respect. Their claim upon the more fortunate is not grounded in deception or any laziness on their part. And the 5th through 8th stages differ from the others in being tete-a-tete, face-to-face encounters between the two parties involved. In each of these stages, the spirit in which the gift is given, or better, the demand is met, or even better, the obligation is discharged, is crucial. In descending order, giving without prior solicitation, giving only after solicitation, giving less than one ought, but with joy, and finally grudging giving round out the picture. There's much to be noted here. I'd like to say a few things. Among the salient points are the avoidance of embarrassment to the beneficiary, the desire to genuinely eradicate the current condition of the poor one by making him or herself sufficient, and the emphasis upon giving with a good attitude. With respect to the latter, Maimonides quotes Job, the book of Job. Did I not weep for him whose day was hard? Was not my soul grieved for the poor? Job 30, verse 25. For Maimonides, anyone who gives tzedakah to a poor person in a surly manner and with a gloomy face completely nullifies the merit of his own deed, even if he gives him 1,000 gold pieces. Great sensitivity and compassion permeate the entire discussion. I noted earlier the intimate connection between tzedakah and justice. This may suggest a kind of grudging giving, or at least a giving without sentiment, a dutiful giving. But as we've seen, this is the lowest level of giving, one springing from a pained attitude. Given the clear connection here between tzedakah and justice, between duty and giving, one might begin to reconceive justice in light of its connection with charity. One might consider whether perhaps the traditional distinction between charity and duty is overdrawn and in need of some revision, a point very forcibly made, as some of you know, by Peter Singer in a classic essay on the relief of global suffering. Singer writes, "The traditional distinction between duty and charity cannot be drawn, or at least not in the place we normally draw it. Giving money to the Bengal Relief Fund," this is Singer's evidence, "is regarded as an act of charity in our society. The bodies which collect money are known as charities. These organizations see themselves in this way. If you send them a check, you'll be thanked for your generosity. Because giving money is regarded as an act of charity, it is not thought that there's anything wrong with not giving. The charitable man may be praised, but the man who is not charitable is not condemned." That's Singer. Well, Like Singer, from this angle, Maimonides will be seen to be an important resource for the non-supererogatoriness of charity. But for now, I wish to focus on what I take to be the most prominent feature of Maimonides' ladder of charity. If we invert the Maimonidean ladder of charity, we'll note that charity is commensurate with anonymity and selflessness. The higher one climbs on the ladder of charity, the less the benefactor is given over to self-aggrandizement, a feeling of superiority. At the highest stage, the benefactor enters into a real partnership with the poor, the object of his giving, so that the latter may not fall and be in need of help. At this stage, the benefactor acts from the vantage point of the beneficiary. Empathy is total. Because consistent with this are the next three stages, which stress either the complete or the partial anonymity of the entire situation. This preserves the beneficiary from embarrassment, but for Maimonides, an equally important feature is that it promotes a certain character in the benefactor. And let me just say a little bit about this. I've written in the past about anger and humility in both Aristotle and Maimonides, and have tended to contrast their respective views. Whereas for Aristotle, a certain righteous indignation and pride are mandated in the appropriate situations, for Maimonides, these latter are proscribed. Maimonides distinguishes between the sage, the hacham, and the saint, the hasid, the pious person. Rank orders the latter above the former and describes the saint, the pious person, as one who exceeds in humility and in irascibility, lack of anger. The ordering is grounded on the rabbinic gloss of the biblical injunction from Leviticus, famous injunction, "You shall be holy." The rabbis gloss this way: as he, the divine, is gracious, so you be gracious. As he is merciful, so you be merciful. The injunction here is to model one's actions on divine actions. And since God has no moral attributes, emotions, is incorporeal after all, on pain of idolatrous anthropomorphism, we should likewise extirpate the self-centered emotions. This is precisely what the pious person does in acting without anger or emotion. Put slightly differently, the Maimonidean moral paradigm goes to the far end of selflessness, this latter virtue understood as incompatible with proper anger and pride, virtues of the Aristotelian self. The Maimonides discussion of charity is part of this moral story. Maimonides is concerned throughout his writings with the extirpation of idolatry. Indeed, the whole purpose of the law of Judaism itself is to bring about this end, the extirpation of idolatry. Now, of course, idolatry takes many forms, and there can be no doubt that for Maimonides, arrogant self-aggrandizement, or less brazenly superciliousness, is prominent amongst them. It is the extirpation of just this attitude that charity is designed to bring about, to compensate. To give charitably, to give as one really ought, and as one ought, is to give without a feeling of superiority, and to give from the vantage point of the beneficiary. So as we see, Maimonides' discussion of charity is more than about giving. We should note the inner attitudinal aspect of the beneficence, as well as the external act of giving itself. We should note the emphasis on anonymity of the transaction. The more anonymity all around, the better. This is meant clearly to counter vanity and embarrassment for, respectively, the donor and the recipient. But most important, and the most meritorious rank, is giving in such a way that the donor empowers the recipient, so that the latter is lifted from his economic viability. Gainful employment is a good way to demonstrably change the status of one in need. So what we see over the course of the history of Jewish thinking on tzedakah is a realization that poverty is real, maybe even ineradicable, and a deep obligation to deal with it, to deal with the poor and the disenfranchised in a fair and equitable way, and in such a way that they may be lifted out of their situation. A major issue which I'm sidestepping, of course, is whether all of this is applicable to Jews alone. Is tzedakah applicable to and for Jews alone? How parochial, or how impartialist, we might say, is the Jewish teaching on the treatment of strangers? As we've noted, it's clear that Maimonides' poor, the beneficiary of charity, are his own brethren. Or, as we've seen, he asks, on whom should the poor of Israel depend? The discussion is seemingly not assimilable to a global context. As I've said, the poor are not suffering humanity. Along these lines, we might also ask, when the Bible grounds non-oppression in the memory that you were strangers, gerim, in the land of Egypt, what status is being referred to by gerim? There's been considerable discussion on this. It seems reasonable to suggest that the Israelites were resident aliens in Egypt, guest workers, we might say, rather like Turks in Germany or Mexicans in our own land. So while the parochial neighborly gloss on charity and simple justice is not without evidence, I prefer to think that the injunction placed on the liberated Israelites is to render justice and care to those in their own land who, like themselves at an earlier time, are outcast and vulnerable to injustice and disadvantage. We might indeed draw certain conclusions with respect to current events, but that's another discussion. I'd like to conclude in a comparative vein, since we have a comparative conference, but since I know nothing about Asian culture, I'll do a different sort of comparison. I appreciate the comparative aspect of our symposium, and in this spirit, I compare and contrast two traditions, or at least spokespersons for two traditions. And in my case, the case study is not between Asian and Jewish traditions, but rather between Greeks and Jews. In her rich commentary on Aristotle's Ethics, Sarah Brody, an excellent commentator, writes, with respect to the comparison of lives, the famous comparison of lives at the end of the Ethics. It's a longish quote, but I think it's a wonderful quote. Quote from Brody on Aristotle. In assessing Aristotle's argument and its practical implications, the modern reader must bear in mind that from Aristotle's standpoint, the reflective, theoretic, and political ideals are the only serious competitors, two sorts of life. We can expand this sparse gallery of cultural icons by including under reflective all manner of creative and artistic activities that call forth the utmost of human imagination and perfectionism, both in themselves and in their products. But this expansion leaves out a major contender of an entirely different kind, one that is very clearly recognized by us. This is the ideal of beneficence to the poor, sick, oppressed, or in whatever way deprived, who lie outside what would ordinarily be considered one's sphere of responsibility. Such an ideal seems to have little to do with happiness, because those who try to live according to it set little store by their own happiness. And insofar as they work to improve the social and material conditions of the needy, their avowed objective may not be those people's happiness, which easily seems a distant and even irrelevant luxury, but rather the focus is on preliminary goods, such as health, security, freedom from slavery, basic education, and jobs. Still, this is clearly an ideal. It is interesting to consider the disparity between the biblical tradition that gave us this central ideal and articulated the virtue of universal compassion, a quality undreamt of by Aristotle on the one side, and Aristotelian eudaimonia, human fulfillment, on the other. God in the Bible enters into human history. He suffers with his people, is not satisfied until they are saved, and in Christianity even becomes a human being himself for that purpose. Even if he is in some sense complete and self-sufficient, he cannot rest in completeness and self-sufficiency as long as there is a world in trouble. Nor is he self-sufficient in coming to its aid, since he depends on human cooperation to heal the world and ourselves. Such a being lacks essential aspects of Aristotelian eudaimonia. Ones, moreover, that are critical for deciding which is its highest form. A humanitarian or charitable ethic, based on the biblical model of divinity, may resemble Aristotle's approach in declaring godlike or godly whoever lives up to its ideal. But it cannot conceive of that ideal as eudaimonia, happiness in Aristotle's sense. So that's Brodie. Now, Aristotle is often presented as the quintessential apologist for the status quo, a conservative thinker whose starting point and, in fact, terminus of his argument are the mores of current society. I think that's unfair to Aristotle. For early on in Book 1, he's very clear that pleasure, money, and honor should not be the aim of life. At least with respect to the last of these, honor, the categorical denial of its centrality, is ipso facto, I think, a deflation of the Homeric ideal, a cultural icon. Further, his final enthroning of reflection, a most private and apolitical activity, is also in its own way, I think, revisionist. So Aristotle is not the apologist he's often taken to be for the status quo. Nevertheless, I think it would be disingenuous to deny that the development of an appropriate character, one that would be accounted as exemplary by common Greek consent, is firmly in Aristotle's view. And even a brief inspection of what he has to say about courage, moderation, liberality, and greatness of soul clarifies the role that the preliminary goods play, what Brodie called the preliminary goods. Aristotle says in the Ethics that happiness requires external goods. It's impossible to perform fine actions if one is without resources. For in the first place, many things are done by means of friends, or wealth, or political power, as if by means of tools. And then again, there are things, the lack of which is like a stain on happiness. Things like good birth, being blessed with by one's children, beauty. For the person who's extremely ugly, or of low birth, or without children, is someone we would not altogether be inclined to call happy, says Aristotle. I've always taken these latter comments as a critique of the Platonic portrait of Socrates as the preeminently happy man. Aristotle is suggesting, contra Plato, that material goods cannot be overlooked in any reasonable account of the human good. This, of course, leaves human happiness open to an extent to the vagaries of fortune, a point the Stoics will focus on, but Aristotle finds the Socratic model too counterintuitive. Whether or not Aristotle has Socrates in view here, and if he does, whether his critique is well-founded, the fact remains that for Aristotle, human happiness depends in part on just those preliminaries, money and so on, that Brodie mentions. A brief inspection of Aristotle amply confirms this suspicion. Happiness depends upon moral excellence, the development of a set of ethical dispositions such as courage, moderation, liberality, magnanimity, and so on. Many of these are quite impossible without money, or as importantly, a certain social standing. One cannot be courageous if one cannot literally suit up for battle. One cannot be moderate if one has base pleasures, those appropriate to non-free men. One cannot be liberal without the money to be liberal with, to be generous with. One cannot be magnanimous or mild in manner if one is lacking in the kind of grandeur that prompts the exercise of these virtues. Given this link between happiness, moral excellence, and material worldly goods, Aristotle, in his own way, evinces unconcern for the poor and the disenfranchised. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 9, he declares neither animals nor children can be deemed happy, because happiness requires moral excellence. It is an immediate inference from this entailment that those for whom moral excellence is unattainable because of their socioeconomic position, are likewise unfulfilled as human beings. And one can appeal to the politics, Aristotle's politics. And Aristotle's rude comments there about the banausoi, the vulgar, day laborers, freeborn whom Aristotle excludes from political membership in his ideal city. Further recalling the very audience for whom the Ethics is written, this points in the same direction. The lectures are for those well on their way to prominence in the city, in the polis, well behaved and predisposed to take the norms and values of the city as starting points. Such an audience will not include the moral skeptic, nor, for present purposes, importantly, will it include the poor, and for different reasons, but that's not the point. It just won't include them. Finally, there's an Aristotelian virtue called liberality, eleutheriothes, which is concerned with money. It's the mean between wastefulness and avariciousness. The discussion of this virtue is a place where you might expect Aristotle to discuss charity. He doesn't. Nor does he discuss it in his discussions of justice and friendship. In the case of liberality, eleutheriothes, the correct course is one in which one gives and takes appropriately. In the case of giving, one avoids giving too much or too little, or giving to those to whom one should not give. That would be unseemly. The expenditure of capital is done for the sake of the fine, and there is not a word about the possibility of it being a fine thing to give to the poor and to the disenfranchised. The poor fall outside the liberal individual sphere of moral responsibility and concern. We can all too briefly connect justice and friendship, other regard, in this context. It's been noted that Aristotelian justice is more akin to the virtues that make for a good colleague than those that make for a good judge, more directly opposed to the love of honor that leads some academics to monopolize conversations or stack departments with supporters, than with the indifference to strangers that lets the poor starve. Not that Aristotelians should be indifferent to starving strangers, but that it is not part of the moral life with which justice is most concerned. For Aristotle, justice and concern for others depends upon a notion of possible reciprocity, of a shared community of concern that enables the possibility of collegial activity. In his discussion of friendship, he's clear that, quote, if the separation between parties, the friends, is too wide, the gulf becomes too wide. As between a man and a god, the friendship is dissolved. The notion of separation here offered, a kind of gulf that makes possible reciprocity impossible, prevents Aristotle from countenancing charity as a virtue and disallows for the possibility of simple humanity grounding the conception of friendship and concern. Now there's a final passage that I would like to point out in this connection, because a direct and fruitful comparison with Maimonides and the topic at hand may be made. As noted a few minutes ago, Maimonides' conception of imitatio Dei, imitation of God, grounds paradigmatically moral behavior. That's what grounds the behavior of the pious person, the Cosmo. The moral saint, the pious one, acts selflessly, and such divine-like activity is consistent with the highest levels of charity adumbrated by Maimonides. Now, compare Maimonidean divine activity and imitatio Dei with Aristotle's views of the same. Aristotle's account of disinterested divine activity in the Ethics underwrites his decision to elect apolitical theoria, contemplation, as the preeminent human activity. In striving to be godlike, we transcend our material selves. But in so transcending our material nature, we leave the moral and political realm behind. It's not that we become or should become hermits, living far from the crowd, but such self-transcendence carries with it a diminution of other concern for others. For both Aristotle and Maimonides, imitatio Dei is the manifest goal of the practical life. But their respective glosses on such activity are instructively different and carry with them radically divergent practical implications. While neither develops an impartialist account, nor has a conception of suffering humanity, Maimonides' view of the divine as acting in the world, albeit dispassionately, entails moral and political activity. Now, I've argued that such dispassionate, selfless activity is consistent with tzedakah, charitable giving, especially with the highest types that we've seen Maimonides presents. Contrarily, Aristotle has fewer resources for such activity at his disposal, if any at all. After all, he is clear that, quote, our belief is that the gods are blessed and happy to the highest degree. But what sorts of practical doings ought we to assign them, asks Aristotle. Just activities? Won't they appear comic, carrying on transactions, returning deposits, and everything like that? Courageous ones? Should we think of them as standing up to frightening things and facing danger because it's a fine thing to do? Liberal ones? But to whom will they give? End quote. That's Aristotle. Self-sufficient, lost in thought, Aristotle's gods proceed apace. Meanwhile, back on earth, Leviticus declares, quote, you shall maintain the stranger or the sojourner. He shall live beside you. I think the Jewish tradition of the treatment of strangers is a